Kaushal, welcome you all in today's episode of Science Simplified only on Bharata First. Through this platform, we provide a unique opportunity to ask questions related to science and technology, which will be answered by the experts. Let your curiosity out and ask questions through a form whose link has been provided in the description box below. Do make use of this opportunity. Now, I would like to introduce to our science expert, Dr. T.V. Venkateshwaran, who is here with us to answer the questions sent to us by our viewers last week. Dr. T.V. Venkateshwaran is a senior scientist at Vigyan Prasar, New Delhi. He is also founder of India Science Wire. He writes regular columns on the developments related to science, technology and society. So, the first question for today is,
Hello, sir. My name is Shonak. My questions are: what is telemedicine? What is the future of telemedicine in India? And what are its possible disadvantages? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, telemedicine is a very upcoming idea, concept, uh, which is basically, according to WHO, is delivery of healthcare services by using information and communication technology. So the healthcare services might be related to diagnosis, it may be related to treatment, or it may be related to prevention of disease. Okay. Why telemedicine? In many places, it is not feasible for patients to come to a doctor. In some cases, specialists are so rare that the opportunity for the patients to get expert opinion are limited. In India, for example, one of the arguments for telemedicine is that the WHO recommendation for doctor population ratio is 1 is to 1000. That is, for every 1000 people, we are expected to have one doctor. But whereas in India, it's 0.62, that is half of it. And mostly it is in cities and urban areas, rural areas, the levels will be much less. We all know about it, right? So in India, the telemedicine is seen as a way by which people who are not able to access medical professionals would be able to use the information communication system to access a medical professional for guidance. Okay, so the telemedicine actually works with the internet backbone. It may be through satellite or through dedicated cables and so on, but essentially it works based on internet. Its a backbone is internet. So in a remote area, a patient comes to a healthcare person who may not be a trained medical professional, okay, who is only a kind of a service provider. And then there may be a rural health center where there might be a general practitioner, but you may need a expert opinion. Then through the information communication system, you are getting into a medical expert or doctor's panel, okay, and your patient's data might be collected and analyzed, okay. So through this, one can get medical advice. That's the idea of telemedicine. Okay, in COVID pandemic, the telemedicine became a kind of a norm. A lot of people started using it. The doctors were not accepting the patients to come to hospital in the beginning, pandemic beginning, fearing that they may spread the virus or they may get infected unintentionally, right? So the virtual consultation with the doctors, through video calls and things of that kind were arranged, right? So it's a kind of telemedicine, right? So that's a beginning of telemedicine, one can say. So one aspect of telemedicine, one can say so. So in pandemic, I mean, we saw around us that it was happening. It's not only for our regular chronic checkup and things like that. Even with respect to COVID itself, many times the consultation took place over telephone or through video calls, right? So US and China has adapted telemedicine in a big way for fighting the COVID, right? And in India, the telemedicine policy expects that the telemedicine would redefine healthcare in rural India, uh, where the doctor-patient ratio is not adequately available. Currently, there are various efforts. For example, there is a Apollo telemedicine network, where the Apollo network is able to reach to other places where there is no Apollo hospital. There is also, for example, PGIMR AIMS network, right? Then ISRO has set up a huge telemedicine network in an experimental basis with 60 tertiary care centers and 384 rural hospitals, particularly in remote and inaccessible areas. Okay. Similarly, there is a Webel from Kharagpur, which is being tried in West Bengal. There is also OncoNet in Kerala, particularly for people affected with cancer, right? So these are all some of the efforts which are taking place in India at this point of time.
Hello, I am Mishika Dheer. I am a student. My question is, what are rare diseases? Is there any treatment available to cure in long run?
Interesting question. So rare diseases, okay. So if you look at rare diseases, they are usually defined from three aspects. What is the total number of people affected with that disease? If it is rare, for example, very, very, very small number, okay, then you call it as rare. Like, for example, blood pressure, hypertension is normal. A lot of people have it. Okay, so we don't call it as rare from that point of view. Okay, so second, is there treatment available? There may be some diseases for which we have not yet found the disease treatment. Okay. So what is the total number of people affected? What is its prevalence? Whether the treatment is available or not? These are the three factors which are used to make a classification of a rare disease. For example, WHO makes a very simple definition. The definition is, if the frequency is less than 6.5 or 10 per 10,000 people, then they call it as rare disease. Okay. Various countries have different definition. For example, in USA, disease that affect fewer than 2 lakh people in the USA. So they don't have percentage. If the total number of people affected in USA is less than 2 lakh, then it is rare disease. But whereas in European Union, it is a life-threatening or a chronic condition which affects no more than 1 in 2,000 patients. Okay, so you have a slightly more complex definition, right? But whereas in Japan, it's related to the prevalence. If there are less than 50,000 of a particular disease, then it is rare. Okay, these are all the various definitions that people use. In India, we use a particular concept. The drug controller uses a particular concept called as orphan diseases and orphan drugs. So why these are called as orphan drugs, orphan diseases? Basically, these are all drugs which are used for diseases which usually affects, let's say, for example, very poor people who don't have paying capacity, or such a small number that it doesn't make economical sense. Rather, you won't be able to make adequate profit. So people won't be willing to invest on them. So that is why they are orphan. So the orphan can happen by two means. The patients may be poor to pay for it, or the number of people are so less that the market may not invest on them. So they are called as orphan diseases and orphan drugs. Basically, using that idea of orphan drugs and orphan diseases, the drug controller of India says that potentially treatable population of 5 lakh in India as a rare disease. Okay. So this includes, for example, certain kinds of cancer, certain kinds of autoimmune disorders, congenital malfunctions, some endemic infections. Okay. Many of them with rare and low prevalence, they are all called as rare disease. In the world, people have listed close to about 7,000 rare diseases with the different rare diseases definition, and roughly about 300 billion patients around the world. In India, it is estimated there are 70 million people in India. Okay. In India, there is an organization for rare disease who have included things like cancer, autoimmune diseases, cystic fibrosis, and various other diseases in this category. Okay, where very small number of people are affected. It's a lifelong, sometimes very dangerous. Okay, uh, most of the such rare diseases in India occur at birth and genetic in nature, 80%. Okay, and roughly in India, 50% of babies born with this kind of rare disease die within a year in India. That's the current estimates in India. Very recently, in 2021, a national policy for rare disease have been approved by the government of India, where about 20 lakh to an individual with certain rare disease as one-time requirement is there is a provision for it, and this provision will be available to not only BPL families but also to 40% of the population covered under Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. Okay, and it will be provided under Rashtriya Arogya Niti. There have been many court cases in various states where people affected by rare disease have approached court saying that they should be given support. So there have been lots of court judgments saying that the state government should pay the people with the rare disease. So taking a comprehensive view, the government has come with this kind of a comprehensive policy on rare diseases. That's rare diseases. Treatment, we don't know. Some of them may have treatment, but the drugs may not be available in quantities because only very few people are being affected. Perhaps it's not being manufactured or manufactured in only one place in the world, so it may be very costly. Okay, and some of this because it's only affecting very small number of people, the market does not invest in research, developing new generation drugs, new treatments for them, unless otherwise there is some kind of a governmental policy, public money is spent, or philanthropy comes in and foots the bill. Okay, so that's the rare diseases.
Hello, sir. My name is Tanvi Mahajan. I am currently preparing for UPSC. My question to you is that please explain the concept of data sovereignty and how it is essential for India's data security needs. Thank you.
First, let's understand what is meant by data sovereignty. Data sovereignty is a concept, particularly that has emerged in the recent past when the data exploded. You know, with social media coming in, internet spreading to nooks and corners, the amount of data generated is very huge. So this concept is that information which has been created or stored or both in digital format will be subject to the laws of the country in which it is located or created. Like, for example, a particular social media company might be a multinational company with its headquarters in some other country. So, with respect to the data which is collected, let's say, for example, India, will Indian law apply on that multinational company, a company which is a foreign company but providing services in India? That's the question. So the data sovereignty says that yes, it should be applicable, and various countries have come to agree to it at this point of time. Although the corporate are not fully in favor of data sovereignty. They are pointing out a lot of issues in it. So, what is the principle behind data sovereignty? First of all, any data that is collected and used should be lawful. There should be some amount of fairness, and there should be transparency. Like, say, for example, a particular website may ask my, let's say, certain personal information or a copy of my identity card, and you don't want that agency to use my identity card elsewhere, right? Without my knowledge, without my expressed permission, right? So that's where the lawfulness, fairness, transparency comes in. And second, the purpose should be limited. For example, if the data is collected for a particular purpose, then it should have a limitation. It should not be used in various other places, because I will have no way of keeping track of where those information are used. Okay. And whatever data that is being collected should be minimal, essential for that particular purpose. Okay. So there should be certain standards with respect to accuracy. Similarly, there should be some storage limitation. If a data is collected from me today, will that company will be permitted to store it for ages, or should that, for example, destroy that information, let's say after every 3 years, 1 year, whatever, some time period? There should be also some integrity. They should not share my information with somebody else. There should be some confidentiality. I have given some information in confidence, right? So that confidentiality should be maintained. And the company which is collecting the data should be accountable. They can't say that, oh, we tried, we can't do anything. That should be accountable. These are all the aspect of data sovereignty in modern times. Okay. So the challenges that comes for the data sovereignty is that earlier data were stored in what is called as servers. So it was all physical items. So you can say that India could say that, for example, all the data collected in India should be saved in servers in India. But today it's cloud. So cloud is a non-physical entity, though it's interconnected with physicality. Okay, finally it is stored in some cloud, I mean some server somewhere. But the cloud service is cutting across number of servers. It's like, for example, internet, right? So if it is so, then how will the law apply to a cloud which is not in any country? That's one big challenge that the firms dealing with the data, like Google and others, are pointing out. Okay. And it's a debate right now going on in data sovereignty, how you would manage it. Similarly, for example, if data is collected in India by an American company, can the American law enforcement agency say that that data should be given to them because it's an American company? These are all challenges that are going on in the arena. There are all debates which are going on in the arena. Okay. So even if it is in the cloud, people are working out whether you can make certain kind of security, so that only I mean, you can segregate the data according to the regions and sovereignty area, and provide that data sovereignty to people. There is a law or a code, protocol one can call it, General Data Protection Regulation. Usually it's called as GDPR. That was made by the European Union, which is seen as a kind of a good standard all over the world. Okay. So if you look at where it is currently there, you can see that most restricted with the GDPR are these countries. Okay, so these are the countries. Minimal restriction, for example, US is minimal restriction, India is minimal restriction, although in India the work for introducing something like a GDPR is taking place. Okay, of course, many parts of Africa there is no law at all, right? So these are all the things that is happening all over the world. If you look at the legislation for data, This is the way the legislation are happening around the world. 66% of the countries have some kind of a legislation. 10% are in the draft stage. Okay, 19% no legislation at all, and about 5%, of course, we don't have data about countries. Okay, so this is the data sovereignty.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Anubha Mishra and I am a student. So my question to you is, what is the future of AI in digital governance, and what are the challenges associated with AI in digital governance? Thank you.
So if you look at, for example, India, digital governance is part and parcel of the program called as Digital India. So in the Digital India, you wanted to create a broadband highways. Basically, you want to create backbones so that the digital data can go. There should be public internet. So there should be some kind of access program so that everyone will be able to access internet. Suppose if the barriers are very high, a large population cannot access internet, then the digital governance will become governance only for some, right? Then there should be information for everyone. It should be available to wider public. Okay. Then there is early hours, universal access, jobs. Okay, electronic delivery of services. Like for example, you want a copy of your documents, etc. I mean, it should be easily retrievable through internet means. Okay, e-governance. That is reforming government through technology is one of the aspect of Digital India. Okay, and also electronic manufacturing, net zero import. These are all some of the aspect of Digital India. But now let's concentrate on this e-governance. So if you look at the e-governance, it has three major legs. One is government to business, government and business, industry, and so on. So e-trade, e-delivery, regulations related to it, and so on, e-procurement, these are all one of the things. Then there is government to citizens, like you are creating e-health records, for example, so that you can have web-based services for health. You can have administration, online administration. You can provide certain kind of transport information through online. Okay, so these are all government to citizen. You also have in e-governance something like government to government. So between let's say state governments to union government, or within union government to different department. Like say for example electronic files. So instead of creating paper file, you create electronic file, and the electronic file moves, and then it's examined. So if you look at the artificial intelligence, till now we are talking about digital, but now coming to artificial intelligence. So in the artificial intelligence, people are talking about applying artificial intelligence to industry, business, so on. One of them is governance and the risk management. So in governance, for example, what are all the areas you can do? For example, you want to provide a credit scheme. Now in COVID times, the government is announcing various credit scheme, right? If you are a sole proprietor and you are doing small business, you need credit for sustaining your profession, right? The government is saying that, for example, Mudra scheme and things like that, right? So in the credit scheme, you need to find a way of selecting beneficiaries. What are we doing today? Today, for example, the government official collects data, you file some application, put together, the government official is taking a decision at some level whether to permit or deny. In this, there are lots of ifs and buts. People would claim from corruption to favoritism to discrimination, right? So many people are thinking that if you bring in artificial intelligence, then this whole process of selection can be more neutral. So how does the artificial intelligence come in? For example, from the earlier data set, that is people when were given such kind of credit scheme by government earlier, what do we learn? Let's say, for example, we are taking at only two factors. Of course, never artificial intelligence will be only two factors. There will be multiple factors. Suppose if I look at, for example, a person's income and the person's saving, okay, from looking at this income and saving, I can know that, for example, if he has a higher income but very low saving, then that person is a high risk person. Similarly, even if your savings are high, if your income is very low, then you are a high risk person because you will not be able to repay. Okay, you will be able to give all your savings, but then what? Right? So, this will be the high risk area. This will be the low risk area. If I create a graph like this, if I put people in this, I mean, I'll get a graph like this. Okay. If I get like that, then I can decide that people who fall in this category, we will give the credit. People who fall in this category will deny the credit, for example, or ask for additional security and things like that. Right? Here, it is not a human being who is making a decision, but artificial intelligence based on earlier data. So this is what is the idea of applying artificial intelligence in governance. One example I'm just giving. But then there are also issues related to this. What is it? One of the important question mark that today people are asking is big data equal to reality? Is big data equal to natural? These are the important questions that they are asking. If the answer is no for any of them, then use of big data without criticism is a big trouble. There is a very interesting work, a book called as Weapons of Math Destruction, which talks about how the algorithms today are creating a condition where, without we knowing, is creating a certain kind of discrimination in the society. Let's look at a very simple example. You just go to the Google image search. Okay, just type the word girl. I did it. Okay, so it's my search. Okay, so I just put girl and then search for images. No other filters. Okay, now what do you see? In these images, most of the images are Western. If there is an African, what is that image looking like compared to, for example, a Western, European or American face? Okay. How many Asians are you seeing here? Right. So it's after all a Google search and being done from India, but still this is what you get when you just put a very neutral word like a girl. So which means the artificial intelligence, which is selecting some images as girl, is somewhat biased. Okay. Not because some human being is controlling it, basically because there has been bias in our human history. After all, the artificial intelligence is learning from human history, right? In human history, there has been bias. Let's say, for example, if you have a job, artificial intelligence job selector, you put your application, there is a firm which wants people, your application is analyzed by the artificial intelligence, and then the artificial intelligence selects some and then give it to the prospective employer. If you look at India, for example, there are many departments, right? In India government, there are many departments. Until now, there have been very few women directors of these departments. So if you use the historical data and you are a woman, you will get lesser weightage by artificial intelligence. So there will be some kind of a discrimination. One experimentally, for example, in US for justice system, one artificial intelligence system was tried out. It gave completely unacceptable results. Like say, for example, a girl who committed crime of stealing candies from a shop, because she did it third time, she got a very heavy stiff punishment. But whereas somebody who indulged in armed robbery, but for the first time, got a much lighter punishment by that artificial intelligence. Okay. Similarly, if you look at the Google ads, one of the studies says that if you are a woman, if you log in using your profile and you are a woman, the ads which come by its own, nobody is sitting there and programming it and giving it to you, right? Women are less likely to see high paid jobs. So that itself is a kind of perpetuating certain kind of discrimination, right? So these are all the major challenges. Basically, artificial intelligence is bias in, bias out. Artificial intelligence is built through our historical data. So in our history, human history, there have been biases against blacks, biases against caste, biases against race, biases against gender. Okay. So all those biases will get inscribed into the artificial intelligence. That is a fear, and people have shown that it is not just fear, but it's a real danger that exists. Okay, and that is why they are warning, or they are suggesting that we should be very careful in extending it. But that is not the end of the story. Once we know a problem in science, we try to find solution. So people are trying to find out how you can eliminate this kind of biases, which might come from a historical background. So people are also working on it. So a new generation AI, which will be having social justice in its aspect, are also something on the cards that people are working on. So gamma ray burst, or there is a sudden flash of gamma rays, huge quantity for a very short duration. So that's why it's called burst. Okay, so it comes in a burst. So if I look at, for example, this image, okay, in this image, okay, sorry, in this image, we can see that on June 13th and July 3, not in a month, okay, it's a galaxy which is about 75,000 light years away. There is a sudden burst of gamma ray, okay, and that's gone. Okay, that's vanished. Okay, so there has been a sudden burst of gamma ray, which is available for few days. Today there is a idea, hypothesis, why this gamma rays occur. I mean, what is called as this sudden burst of gamma rays. Okay, so this why does it occur? Today the dominant idea is when black holes are formed, when black holes are given birth, okay, when they are being born, these gamma rays come out. That's the current theory. Okay, so when how does a black hole occur? When there is a very huge star, because of its self gravity, it will start compressing and compressing, okay, collapsing in it itself, and because of its whole gravity, it will become more denser, so dense that electrons will go away, only nucleus will be there, and again it will become more denser, the nucleus will go away, and then protons and neutrons will join together, okay, and then when it becomes even more denser, right, there'll be a sudden shock wave, because a lot of energy will be thrown out from it. When that energy is thrown out, they are mostly thrown out in gamma rays. Of course, there will be also later some X-ray, but there'll be a gamma ray. So that gamma ray is what we are seeing a sudden burst of gamma ray when the black holes are getting formed. Okay, so the gamma rays don't come on all direction. From sun, for example, the light goes on all direction, but the gamma rays will come out like a beam, like a lighthouse beam. Your lighthouse beam goes in a particular direction, right? And then it rotates. So in the same way, when the black hole is getting formed, there will be something called as an accretion disk, and the jet will be on the axis. Okay, so if we happen to be on the jet direction, then we will get the gamma ray burst. That's what is happening. Okay, so when the black holes are formed, that is when you get this gamma ray burst for a short time. Then after that, you get the afterglow of that black hole birth.
Thank you, sir, for your insightful explanation of the questions. On this note, it's a wrap up of today's episode of Science Simplified only on Bharata First. Be scientific, be inquisitive. Please like, share, and subscribe to such amazing content on Bharata First. See you soon.